And we are live. Hello everyone, নমস্কার। Edinburgh বৈঠকের তরফ থেকে আপনাদের সবাইকে very warm welcome. We are very excited today to welcome you to a show which is going to explore early Edinburgh, early Indians in Edinburgh, and especially the Tagore connection. And we have two special people with us. A little bit about them first. So we have with us Hauke, who is an information manager and part-time tourist guide. He's also a researcher of the Edinburgh-India relations in both Scotland and India, and been an honorary fellow of the Edinburgh India Institute since 2012. We also have with us Professor Roger Jeffery, who is a professorial fellow in sociology and associate director of the Edinburgh India Institute at the University of Edinburgh. He spent extensive periods of research in South Asia and has also edited India in Edinburgh 2020. Now over to Marik for a bit of an overview of what we are going to hear today.
থ্যাংক ইউ মধুমন্তী। শুভ সন্ধ্যা জানাই সবাইকে। আমরা চলে এসেছি আবার এডিনবরা বৈঠকে আর একটা বৈঠক নিয়ে। প্রতিবারের মতো এবারও আমরা একটা কিছু নতুন বিষয় নিয়ে এসছি আপনাদের কাছে। আজকের বিষয় আমাদের খুবই সব বাঙালিরই খুব মনের কাছে, সেটা অবশ্যই রবীন্দ্রনাথ। কিন্তু রবীন্দ্রনাথের আর আলাদা করে পরিচয় আমাদের দিতে লাগবে না, আমরা সবাই জানি তিনি কে। কিন্তু আমরা কি সত্যি তাকে চিনি? আমরা তাকে কবি হিসাবে চিনি, সাহিত্যিক হিসাবে চিনি, নাট্যকার হিসাবে চিনি, গীতিকার হিসাবে চিনি, কিন্তু মানুষ হিসাবে কতটা চিনি? সেই রবীন্দ্রনাথেরই মনুষ্য সত্তাটাকে আজকে তুলে ধরার চেষ্টা করব আমরা। সেই তার জীবনের এক কি বলবো অচেনা এক পরিচ্ছদকে আমরা আজকে উদ্ঘাটন করব। তো আজকে বেশি কথা না বাড়িয়ে সেটা দিয়ে শুরু করা যাক। তো আজকে তাহলে অতিথিদের ডেকে নেওয়া যাক।
Hello, Professor.
Hello, hi.
Hello.
Hi.
Namaskar.
Namaskar, friends in the West.
First of all, a very warm welcome to both of you. And if you would like to share a few words about yourself and the program that we're going to have today, to your liking.
Yes. Basically, originally about around New Year's Eve, I had together with Shumit, I had the idea of doing something about early Indians in Edinburgh. Together with Professor Jeffery here with Roger, we've been working for quite a few years now on any kind of links between Edinburgh and India, and we thought Edinburgh Baitak might be interested, so we do something about early Indians in Edinburgh. Now, while we were working on bringing that into shape, we got a little bit sidetracked because we found something. We were just looking into one of the characters in that presentation and found was quite a lot more of a story to it. And that's why today is specifically just about one person. That's why it's a bit more focused today. Maybe there's a bit follow in later installments about the rest of the early Indians in Edinburgh.
Yeah, and we're very keen on anybody who's got additional information or wants to be contributing to what we're doing or thinks we should be doing something in different ways. We'd be very pleased to hear about how that might work out. We both have a long-term commitment to this project, and you'll see in the first slide a bit more about that. So anything, anywhere, we're open to suggestions.
Yeah, like Roger hints at here, that is very much work in progress. The Edinburgh India progress, the early Indians, and especially even this one. A lot of the stuff which we're going to talk today, 2 weeks, sometimes even a week ago from today, neither us nor anybody else in the world seems to know about. So there might be mistakes. There will be an awful lot of open questions, very interesting questions, but questions which are for now open or probably will remain open. So yeah, that's it's work in progress. That's what makes it so exciting at the moment.
Absolutely. We don't want to keep the audience waiting any longer, so we would like to jump straight into the presentation.
Okay, I start sharing the screen.
So while Hauke is sharing his screen, so if you have any question, you can ping in the chat. So we'll just relay them to Hauke and Roger.
Good, yes. Yeah, like Roger said, we are a project based in the India Institute at the University of Edinburgh. And it's basically, we are finding everything which got here in Edinburgh, which got anything to do with India. It can be persons, it can be museum, bits and museum collections and galleries. I myself have done quite a lot of work on cemeteries and on schools to an extent. So far, there's been a couple of outcomes of that, a couple of very good outcomes. There's Indian Edinburgh website on the university website, for instance, which we can have a look at. There's a lot of very interesting detail there. We worked out some walking tours. There's an app called Curious Edinburgh, or website as well, which you can look at. And there's quite a lot of interesting tours on there. And two of them are from our Edinburgh India project, one for the old town, one for the new town. And then we have last year, I think, or year before last, Roger has edited us all together and brought out a very good book called India in Edinburgh, very simply, and it's available from Routledge in the UK or somewhat cheaper from the Social Science Press in New Delhi. So that's the two big outcomes. We are further working on an anthology. Roger especially is working on that. We're having these talks with Edinburgh Baitak obviously now, and we are working on a guidebook to India connected sites in the city, which is also getting bigger and bigger and bigger. We'll see when that will be finished. So those are the two things. One of the questions which came up was what sparked your interest in India? Roger, I don't know whether you want to talk about it. I think you came to India the hard way quite a while ago.
Yeah, quite a long time ago. So I don't want to go into details of my youth when I was very, very different. But I first came to India in 1971, having driven overland. And it's not that I have anything against Bengal, obviously not, but I didn't get further than Delhi on that occasion. So my first visit to Bengal was in 1978. I went to do some work on conditions in tea estates in Assam, which was a very interesting eye-opener to Kolkata at the time.
Wow.
Yeah, I myself have, ever since childhood, from stamp collecting days, I guess as a little boy, had an interest in the British colonial empire. And that was my main interest in India. To some extent, it still is. So it's one thing which works well into this presentation. On a more personal level, obviously, then most of you, at least some of you, will know that I then married somebody from Bengal, married Shmita from Calcutta, and that's how I physically, actually, first time went to India, basically for the wedding celebrations. Yes, that's how I got into India and into an Indian family.
Okay, lovely. So I'm going to ask one question now. So this is a really fun question. You can choose to answer it or not. So the first time that you went to India, to the east from the west, what was the most striking cultural difference that you faced, or maybe you were amazed by it or shocked by it? What was that difference? Very interesting to know.
So I'll maybe answer quickly. Two things. Firstly, because we drove overland, we came through the Khyber Pass and down through to Peshawar. And the big difference, the thing that really mattered, was there were people everywhere walking across the road. We had to slow down. It was very different. But the second thing, I think much more significant, is how amazingly hospitable people have been every time I've been in India. They give you time, they give you tea, they want to talk to you, and it's so different from, I'm sure, your experiences of coming to Edinburgh.
And
the hospitality and the friendliness and the fact that people have time, that's something which struck me very much as well, especially in Calcutta. I have to say other cities are a bit busier. But no, generally, I think it's a character trait of the Indian people in general. What struck me about India is not so much the similarity, it's not so much the differences, but the similarities. There is this idea, and it's probably different for me because I directly came straight into an Indian suburb and an Indian family. There's this idea that, oh, India, it's so different, it's so colorful, it's so exciting, so restless, or totally incredible, very spiritual and all that stuff. And if you get directly into family, you notice that in the end of the day, Indians are just human beings like the rest of the world, basically. Everybody has a shower in the morning, has breakfast, goes to work, comes back from work, likes things, hates things, and stuff like this. So that's what struck me most about India, because it's not this sort of stereotypical of image you've got of India abroad, that it's all very completely different, totally colorful and stuff like this. What I liked about it is that, yeah, it's just people like us, basically.
Lovely. Wonderful. Okay.
Going on, starting with a picture here of Rabindranath Tagore, and yeah, that book is something which Shmita, my wife, before she even was my wife, gave me as one of her first presents to me, as a biography by Krishnadatta and Andrew Robinson. And that's kind of where I first heard of the person we're going to talk to about today, about Annapurna Turkhud. And like I say, we didn't come at it from a Tagore studies point of view. We came at it from a point of Edinburgh links. And in the book, it is mentioned that there was this person who had a close connection with Tagore in Mumbai at the time, Annapurna Turkhud, and that he was there for 2 months, but she then married a Scotsman. She continued to use Nalini, the poetic name Tagore had given her, as a literary name. And then the other thing is that she died young in Edinburgh in obscurity. And that's kind of all we knew. And that spurred me, well, she has to be in our project. If she's Indian, she's in Edinburgh, she has to be in our project. So let's find out more about her, basically. That's how we came into her. We couldn't find an awful lot about her in the first place. So we looked at the Indian side of her life. How did she get to know Tagore? What are the actual links? And basically, Rabindranath, very young, 17-year-old, he was essentially sent by his brother Satyendranath from Ahmedabad, where he was getting a bit bored, down to Kandawadi, which is Mumbai, suburbs of Mumbai in those days, still quite rural, near Chowpatty. And he was there for 2 months in 1878, basically to improve his English, because he was going off to university in England to study law. The family had a daughter, Annapurna. She was a little bit older, about 2.5, 3 years older, and she had just come back from school in England, so she was up to the latest fashions, the latest ideas, the latest English language, conversational language especially, not just book language, and that's what they were interested in. So she basically became his English tutor. He translated a bit of his poetry for her, because he was already very interested in poetry, and interestingly, so was she. So she enjoyed that very much. There's idea that they were attracted. I mean, Tagore himself later mentioned that she implored him that he had such a beautiful face and he should never hide it by wearing a beard. That obviously didn't come off that plan. Tagore famously had one of the most famous beards of 20th century India, so that didn't come off. But that was one of her ideas. He wrote some poems in her memory, probably, and there's even discussion, rumor that a marriage was proposed by Atmaram, Annapurna's father, but that for some reason, potentially because of the age gap, she was like 2-3 years older, and Tagore himself at 17 was only just going off to university, still quite young, that was rejected by Rabindranath Tagore. But at least a delegation from the Turkhud family Turkhud family seem to have gone to Shantiniketan to see Devendra to potentially propose that. We're not entirely sure what they did there. There was a question about Anna was educated in Britain, spoke a lot of European languages. Was that typical for Indian women at the time? Were there others who were educated in that way? And that's a very good question, because no, obviously it wasn't typical of all Indian women at the time, but there's a kind of class and outlook her family and many other families related to her, like the Tagores, like the Fanes in Calcutta and so on, had. It wasn't that 100% untypical. Her own sister, Manak Turkhud, she went abroad to study and to Edinburgh, in fact. She had a niece who also went to study in Edinburgh and London. And about the sort of 1870s, 1880s, there was a bit of a wave almost of Indian girls going off to the West to study, especially medicine in Edinburgh. Roger, I think, knows a bit more about that. Indian girls going to Edinburgh to study medicine those early years. Like we've got from Bengal, we've got Kanamini Ganguly, for instance, who came in the 1890s, who was one of the first women in India even to graduate from an Indian university. She then went on to Edinburgh. We've got from the Parsi community in the Mumbai area, we've got Hirabai Batiwala, for instance. The now Roji family, the father was in Indian National Congress, later an MP here in Finsbury in the UK for the Rebel Party. His daughter went to university in the UK as well. There was quite a bit, and they were not entirely the first ones. There were earlier, there were Anglo-Indians, for instance, who came to Edinburgh, Annie Wardler, Janganandan, for instance. And we have some, apart from university, we've got some records, although girls' schools generally don't have good records we've been able to access yet. But we know of some girls, Jane Gordon Cumming, who comes in the early 1800s to school here, who was involved in a trial about her schoolmistresses, and she became kind of a little bit famous with that. And we've got another schoolgirl who came, who was also Anglo-Indian, who had, both of them had Indian mothers, who was Margaret Stewart Tyndall Bruce, who became quite rich and was a benefactor to the university, who also came to Edinburgh first as a schoolgirl. So there's quite a bit. There's a very interesting program on the BBC a couple of weeks back. You can probably still get it on BBC Sounds. Not specifically about Edinburgh in this case, as a girl, Dorothy Banerjee, again, Bengali Christian background. She went to Aberystwyth in Wales and managed to win the Welsh National Poetry Competition, the Eisteddfod. So something on BBC Sounds about her. So Anna Turkhud, yes, she was unusual on a national scale for India, but in her class and her kind of family, it was not that unusual. It was just at her time. She was one of the first, but at her time it was beginning to become the fashion to go abroad. The poems, yes. Is the idea of Nalini. We've got the fact that Nalini gave that name to her. It seems to be from Tagore's memories that she kind of asked him to do that. So it seems that Nalini, that idea, the name, wasn't specifically coined for her. There seems to be some poems in Ahmedabad before he came to the Turkhud family where Tagore used the name Nalini already, and that's more of an idea along Petrarch and his unattainable love, Lara. We know Tagore was interested in Petrarch, Italian poet of the Middle Ages, that he was developing love poetry along those lines, and that Anna Turkhud wanted that name given to her, and that he then spun more poems around. Now that Nalini actually had a sort of physical form for him, spun more poems around it. Also, he kept using the Nalini idea, the Nalini theme, after he had gone to England and come back to India and so on. And there's even suggestions that the name he gave his wife once he was married, Miranili, that was also an echo of the whole Nalini idea. So Anna Turkhud, was she the only Nalini? Was she the Nalini? No, but she definitely was a Nalini, and she was probably the most flesh and blood of the Nalinis he had in that sense. There's a poem here which maybe some of you want to read out.
Mari,
I can
please do the
try.
honors. Yeah.
Okay. I'm actually seeing in mobile, so it's quite small.
Oh, sorry.
So I'm trying. So, শোনো নলিনী, খোলো গৌ আঁখি, ঘুম এখনো ভাঙিল নাকি, দেখো তোমারই দুয়ার পড়ায়ে, শুনি প্রভাতের শুনি প্রভাতের গাথা মোর, দেখো ভেঙেছে ঘুমের ঘোর, দেখো জগৎ উঠেছে নয়ন মেলিয়া, নতুন জীবন লোভী, তবে তুমি গো সজনী, যাইবে নাকি, আমি যে তোমার কবি. That's all. Actually, I have recited it in a horrible way.
Well, we weren't going for the I Stanford here, so yes, no, but much better than I could have done it, certainly. Yeah, we were another question which came, which was we are spoiled for choices. We're looking at Tagore's work, but what is our favorite, mine and Roger's favorite work?
I certainly want to know this. We want to know this from both of you. Yeah.
Well, if I start, my favorite work on Tagore, I must say, is something which I came across last year when I traveled out there, which was his architect. I've gone to Bengal for 20 years, but I've never been to Shantiniketan, and finally I managed to make it out there. And I had never really, from the photos, I never really connected with Tagore's architecture. I always found it a bit dumpy and a bit clay-based and stuff like this. It's not very impressive. But once I was actually at these buildings, in these buildings, I completely changed my mind about it. I 100% turned around on it, and I really, really loved them. And what attracted me to them was what I think is generally very important about Tagore's work is the humanity of it. That the buildings are not there to impress you. They're not like huge columns and endless marble corridors and stuff like this. It is all on the human scale. It's all on the scale. It speaks to the landscape it's in. It uses the local materials. It works with the local traditions. It's not there to impress. It's there to make you feel as a human being, to develop as a human being with other human beings and landscape and nature around you. And I think that's what really got to me with the architecture and what really impressed me. That's why I think, off the top of my head, that's the most impressive work of Tagore's, which spoke to me.
And I have to, you'll probably throw me out of the studio now when I say I don't speak any Bengali. My Hindi is, I can get by. I practice with taxi drivers and I can run an interview, but I can't read any poetry. So it's more the idea that I find fascinating, and it's this relationship between Tagore and the Geddes family, Patrick and Arthur Geddes, and finding him translating Burns' poems into Bengali. The idea of that I find fascinating, but don't ask me to tell you anything about the quality or otherwise of the translation.
Okay, so now that you've already brought on the subject of knowing the language Bengali or Hindi, and you said you are conversational in Hindi, it's up to you, but would you like to speak to us in Hindi a couple of lines, if you wish?
Oh,
you can say anything you like.
बिल्कुल नामुमकिन है. ऐसा
That's excellent. You've just,
Yeah, that's
absolutely said
quite
it
good, actually.
yes, with the proper accent also. Okay. Now, Hauke da, your turn.
Yes. কেমন আছেন? খুব ঠিক আছে.
Lovely.
Yes,
Thank
my
you so
Bengali
much
is
for.
my Bengali. I'm afraid, even after 20 years, is less than impressive. I have to say that, especially if I'm not
But thank you
prepared.
for indulging us. Yeah.
Whenever. Moving swiftly on from that embarrassment, we can talk about Anna's family, because she comes from quite an interesting family. Obviously, you would guess that a family who sends their girl off to England at that stage must be quite a forward-thinking, open to the world kind of family. And the Turkhud's are indeed such a family. Her father is quite famous, Atmaram Turkhud, in Mumbai especially. He is a doctor, he is a social reformer, he created a kind of Brahmo Samaj kind of society out in Mumbai, which fought against superstitions, old traditions, widow remarriage, against child marriage, things like that. He was one of the founders of the Bombay Natural History Society. Later on, that might be interesting. Grant Medical College, she's fighting against contagious diseases, which other members of his family will continue that work later on. He knew personally Nalini Tagore, that's why young Rabindranath came to him. So he had family, he had connections over to Bengal and other Western educated Indians as well at the time. Satyendranath was famously the first Indian in the Indian civil service who passed the exams for that. Her uncle, also famous, especially for people who work on Sanskrit and Marathi. He brought out a Marathi grammar and things like that. Her older brother had already been to university in London, chemistry, mathematics, geology, very much into natural sciences. 1878, the year, interestingly, when Tagore stays as a family, he has already married in England an English girl, Alice Milne Ackroyd, for instance. So they are quite open to foreign marriages, at least for the sons, it seems. She's got a younger brother who also studies medicine, who later will on to work against malaria. And she's got a sister, at least. We don't quite know how many children they've got, but we know of these three at least, well, four, including Anna, who's also going to study in England, doing important work on the plague. I was asked whether there's links between that and Brahmos out in Kolkata, the Brahmo Samaj and so on, and whether that's one of the contacts for the Tagore family. I'm pretty sure it is, yes. Devendranath was strong on Brahmoism, so was Atmaram, so they would have known about that. They would have worked together about that. Keshub Chandra Sen, another Brahmo from Calcutta, famous, somewhat controversial, especially in 1878 Brahmo, also had strong links and had Atmaram with his work. So there's quite a bit of that. Anna herself also seemed to have interest, because one of the things she's left behind from her time in England is actually a signature and an entry in a guest book in Arnosvale Cemetery in Bristol. And Arnosvale Cemetery, most of you will know, is obviously a place where Ramohun Roy is buried. So she went to 1876. She went to visit his memorial there, and and her signature has been found. Her and probably a brother signature has been found there in the guest book.
Okay, now we've got a comment on the last slide. I'd just like to show it to you. So we were talking about the architecture at Shantiniketan, and Vashividi has left a comment for us. She says Gandhi and Tagore's favorite building at Uttarayan was Shamali, the mud hut, simple, close to soil, and beautiful. So,
good, yes. Yeah, the architecture really is, well, it's not amazing. That's the point. It's not meant to be amazing. That's the thing. It goes to you as a person.
So
Yes.
there are lots of praise for your Roger's Hindi and your Bengali as well.
Well, that's very polite. At least in my case, that's very polite. I'll thank you for that. Yes, धन्यवाद. Yes, Nalini, what do we know about her? And the answer, quite frankly, is not all that much yet. We've been digging for some time, and we found a lot about the men in her life. And obviously, by the nature of the 19th and even the 20th century, it's the men who tend to leave the documentary traces and evidence. Most of the properties in their name, etc., etc., etc. So, by nature, you find less about women than you do about men. But yeah, with Anna, it's especially for such an educated and seemingly quite lively person, it's odd that we haven't yet found more about her. There was a question of, because we know she used the literary name Nalini. What if we found anything which she's written herself? And so far, the only thing I found is that she's written a letter to the Spectator and the Times on India called The Mental Seclusion of India. I don't even know the date for that. I haven't seen it. I haven't written it. I've just found an entry in an archive of it. That's all I found of her work so far, which is a bit frustrating. And we've only really got one photo, the big photo we know that is of her. The other photo next to her, we're not even sure whether that is her, whether that may be a niece. But yeah, one photo and really not much else apart from the men in her life. Now, the men in her life, that's where it gets interesting, because we've got a bit more to report about them. And that is the marriage to a Scotsman, which we had heard about earlier on in the biography of Tagore. And we found he was Harold Littledale. He's not Scottish by the looks. He's born in Ireland. Doesn't necessarily make him Irish, but he's certainly born in Ireland, and all the rest of his brothers and sisters are as well. Educated in Trinity College, Dublin, also pretty Irish. Very likely Protestant from where he went to school, I would think, but not Scottish Protestant, very likely more the Anglican bend of it. We knew he went to India. We don't know why. His family doesn't seem to have any obvious Indian connection, but somewhere between 1876 and 1879, he goes to India. We don't exactly know when. He married out there. He married Anna. November 1880, apparently. That's what we know so far. We don't know how he met her. Why suddenly a newly arrived Irish-British academic would suddenly just go up to a house in Chowpatty and marry a girl from there. And why the family would suddenly also say yes, I don't know. It's a bit of a mystery. They've got a daughter very soon. In fact, according to the records, even before they were married, 2 months before they were married, it seems to be born. So we doubt whether all these dates are entirely accurate. I would be surprised if they had a daughter 2 months before they were married. But yeah, that's what we know so far. They've got 3 more children. They go off to Baroda. He becomes a vice principal in a college in Baroda and professor of literature and history. That sounds, off the top of the head, sounds a little bit dull, but it isn't, in fact, because Baroda at the time they go there is a very, very exciting place. They just had an awful lot of trouble with their previous Maharaja, who went around killing people and got deposed, especially after he tried to kill the British resident. And they've now started a new clean sheet. They brought in somebody called Madhava Rao, the British brought in as Prime Minister for Baroda. And he is the guy who sorts out Indian states, basically. He reforms them. He's done it in Madras, he's done it in Travancore, he's done it in Indore, and now he's doing it in Baroda. And he does land reform, he does school reform, he expands the railways together with the new Maharaja, sets up libraries, does a lot for social reform, things like that at the time. And obviously Anna is from a family which is very much into that. Anna's brother, older brother, is also in Baroda at the time. We assume that Harold Littledale is also in favor of these. Harold himself becomes tutor to the young Maharaja, who's quite young at the time, and becomes a lifelong friend of the new Maharaja, and they together work especially on vernacular education. He becomes, Harold Littledale becomes the education minister basically for Baroda, and vernacular education for Gujarati education. And they start a very remarkable project at the time, which many in India thought would never fly, just too complicated, just too chaotic for India. They do compulsory and free primary schooling. Baroda state, princely state of Baroda, is the first area in India, even before British India, Calcutta, anywhere. Baroda is the first place which does that. And Harold Littledale seems to have a very large hand, together with the Maharaja and the Prime Minister, in doing that. Apart from that, he's interested in nature a lot. He travels a lot around, especially the Himalayas. We've got quite a lot of photos, not necessarily by him, but bought by him as souvenirs, it seems, of Himalayan saints, Nainital, Muri, Mussoorie, hill stations, basically. But not just the touristy experts. He seems to be interested in landslides and the way the ecology works and things like that. So, yeah, a very interesting man. And we can imagine that Anna, with her background, with her family background, will have joined in a lot of his work, especially as, unlike Harold, she will have known the local languages, will have known the local culture a lot better than he would have done, seeing that he doesn't seem to have any previous Indian connections. Yeah, that's what we can say on that. She gets baptized as a Christian in a mission church near her home in Chowpatty in Mumbai. She is interestingly baptized at least 2 years after their marriage. So it doesn't seem to have been a condition on her becoming a Christian the moment she got married. So we don't know whether she herself then developed an interest or whether she was later brought towards it by her husband. Her brother has married 4 years earlier already in a Christian church in England, so we assume that he himself probably had already converted to Christianity. And there is a tendency amongst Brahmos at the time, and they are, the Turkhuds are of the Brahmo stand, of Christian missionaries having connections with the Brahmos and to some extent using the Brahmos to gain converts. And there's, especially in the Calcutta Brahmos, there's quite a bit of discussion and anger about that after a while, and especially Atmaram's contact, Keshab Chandra Sen, has been criticized for that to some extent. So maybe it's an outflow of that Christianity comes into the family. So yeah, we then said, okay, now we know quite a bit about the Indian life. What about all this business in Edinburgh now? She's supposed to have died a Scots academic. Well, she didn't. There's no evidence that Harold ever even came near Edinburgh. He certainly wasn't Scottish. She's supposed to have died in obscurity in Edinburgh, but if she didn't live in Scotland, why would she trouble herself to die here? So we then looked for records and couldn't really find anything about her living or dying here. So we kind of felt like we had hit a bit of a brick wall, to be honest, with this whole work, and she didn't seem to have any Edinburgh connections after all. Now, a question had come in, did Tagore have any other friends and acquaintances in Edinburgh? Roger has already mentioned Arthur Geddes, who was here from Edinburgh and later came back to Edinburgh to be geography professor here at the university. Patrick Geddes, Arthur Geddes' father, is another big Edinburgh connection. Patrick Geddes basically is a man who saved the Edinburgh Old Town from the skip, because there were plans basically of raising the Edinburgh Old Town and pulling it all down, just like Glasgow, for instance, has done at the time. And Patrick Geddes, he was a town planner. He was interested in ideas of ecology, of interaction between nature and people, of interaction between people and other people, different classes of people, different nations of people. And you can hear that very much vibes with the ideas of Tagore. And very much thank you also to Bartleby Fraser here, who did quite a bit of work on the letters and relationship between Tagore and Geddes. They really did get on. And Geddes went out to India. He worked on plans for Shantiniketan. He was a town planner in Mumbai and in Madras as well, Chennai as well. His wife, in fact, sadly died in Mumbai as well, I believe. And Arthur then, like Roger already mentioned, went off to Sriniketan because Arthur, his son, was interested partly in the literature of Tagore, but also in the rural reconstruction aspect of Bengal, and wrote his PhD thesis, I believe, on that. So, yeah, that's a big link between Edinburgh and Tagore. Tagore himself never came to Edinburgh, which is a bit odd, considering that he seems to have traveled to pretty much every other part of the world. But maybe, you know, Edinburgh and Scotland came to him, so he didn't have to come to Edinburgh. Other members of the Tagore family did go quite a bit earlier, in fact. There's record of a Babu Dwarkanath Tagore getting the freedom of the city of Edinburgh, no less. He was the first Indian to be so honored in the city chambers. And he even went down to Holyrood to see the still very young Queen Victoria at the time. And Dwarkanath Tagore, obviously the grandfather of Rabindranath. Big industrialist, big businessman in Calcutta at the time, but also very involved in anti-slavery. And I think that's probably the reason why he was honored in Edinburgh, because he was a big anti-slavery campaigner at the time, and for fighting for rights of indigenous people. He had a society like this, which was also quite popular in Edinburgh. There were quite a lot of people in Edinburgh who belonged to that, I believe. So, yeah, so Wellings, he donated some miniature paintings to the gallery, to the what's now the Talbot Rice Gallery at the university, some Jaipuri miniatures. So yeah, that's the Tagore connection which Edinburgh had as far as we knew. There was another question about whether there are any other Bengalis in Edinburgh.
Yes.
Widely out from the Tagore family. Yes, there were. Medical, a lot, which isn't a surprise because we have to remember Edinburgh University, until fairly recently, more than half of the students were always medics. So a lot of people came out here as medics. Sharat Kumar Malik, who was at the National Medical College later in Calcutta, he came in the 1890s. Kadambini Ganguly, the first Indian female university graduate in all of India. She came here, we already mentioned that. She later was Ops and Gynae in Lady Dufferin in Calcutta, and was also quite active in politics. She was one of the first women in the Indian National Congress to organize women for the Indian National Congress. We've got a very interesting person from Bengal who came as a tourist to Edinburgh. She was with her husband in Great Britain at the time for Queen Victoria's Golden Jubilee in 1887. And she was Shuniti Devi, Marani of Kuchbehar. Bells will probably ring with Brahmos because Shuniti Devi is the daughter of Keshab Chandra Sen, who was a friend of Atmaram Turkhud, who was the father of Anna Turkhud. So they would have known each other. We've got artist Fanandranath Bose, who's in the early 20th century quite famous sculptor who studied in Edinburgh, who worked with Rodin in Paris, who worked a bit in Baroda, was supposed to work on the Victoria Memorial in Calcutta, but didn't like the style and refused. He did some war memorials here in surroundings of Edinburgh, and some work in churches in Perth, for instance. He didn't just study here. He had a wife here in Edinburgh in the end, and he had a studio in Edinburgh as well, so he was an Edinburgh man and very much liked Scotland, although he had originally very much wanted to go to Italy instead, but Scotland really grew on him once he was more or less his only option to come here, but it really grew on him. And another famous Bengali is Malanobis, not the Barakpur Road Statistical Institute Malanobis, but the other one, Subhachandra, the biologist. He was here studying biology, obviously, but he was also very active politically in the Edinburgh India Association, one of the oldest India associations in Britain, and he was president for a while. And unlike many other students at the time, he was very much in favor of allowing women to study and attend lectures at the university. And he says it was one of his proudest moments when they finally walked into his class and he'd gotten it through. So, yeah, Roger also found out quite a bit about another famous Bengali who came to Edinburgh and was here for quite a while, which is P.C. Rai, Prafula Chandra Isaac, the famous chemist, Bengal chemical industries.
Yeah, I could say a little bit about him. Maybe he came as after he'd been to Presidency College and several other parts of the educational system in Bengal, but he got a degree and then he even got a higher degree beyond a PhD from the University of Edinburgh. And he wrote about it, and he came back to Edinburgh in 1936 and talked to the Edinburgh Indian Association about his life in Edinburgh. So there's really quite a lot about him. But maybe the thing that might be most interesting is that the principal of the university at the time was a man called William Muir, who had been a serious man in the British rule in the Northwest provinces, not the Northwest Frontier, but the Northwest provinces, and retired and became the principal of the university. And he finally retired at the age of 84. But he set up a competition for people to write about the impact of British rule in India. And P.C. Roy wrote what became, I think, the second or third in the competition, and skillfully tried to criticize British rule in a variety of ways. That was then printed, and quite a lot of interesting discussion about the views that he took at the time. But he was Gandhian before Gandhi. He lived a very simple life. He was very strong in nationalist activities. He gave away his salary and set up what became, as you know, a very large industrial chemical works. So some of that was formed while he was in Edinburgh, I think in the 1870s, the 1880s.
Yeah, any other questions come?
We have a comment.
Yep.
From Pashviri again. She says, Acharya Prafulla Chandra Roy obtained his BSc and DSc from Edinburgh.
Ah, yeah.
Yeah, that's...
Yeah, he had quite an active time in Edinburgh. Yeah, we kind of had hit a bit of a brick wall with the Nalini Turkhud in Edinburgh idea. In a way, it got even worse because the more you Google, the more you find. And what we did find was a mention of a Miss Nalini, and she was supposed to have used the word Nalini Turkhud as a novelist and well-known film star in Pune. Book was published, The Jagirdar of Palna. I haven't read the book, I have to admit, but I haven't been able to get hold of it. There's only one copy in the whole of Britain, and which is in the British Library, apparently, Roger tells me. But basically, it's quite a dramatic book, sort of parallels Jane Eyre, and there's a lot of things which chime with the life of Anna. There's some names which sound very familiar from her biography. She's chased by a sort of evil Maharaja called Gaikwad, against sort of hints of Baroda there, and the evil Maharaja of Baroda at the time, before they went there. There's steams of young doctors selflessly giving their life in charity clinics, but like her father and her brothers did and her sisters did and things like that. you have a feeling that somebody must have known about her life to steal all these ideas and put them into that book. She's also very progressive. Wants new women for a new India, things like that. But the trouble is, it's published in 36, and she would have been 78 by then and supposedly dead for 45 years. Also, his film star business, first film 34, she would have been 76, which is pretty late to start a Bollywood film career. So we have since found out that there has been a niece of her who was actually called Nalini. Not just an artist name, but she was actually named after her aunt, probably. And she was born like in 1911. So we are pretty sure that she is the film star, certainly, and pretty sure that she is also the author of the book. So another interesting, very exciting, but ultimately dead end, I'm afraid. Yeah, we were asked what's the process of our researches, and yes, very much that. We'll find, I mean, we have plans, honestly, we do. We have plans of what we want to find out, and Roger is very focused on what we want to put out in the end. But with the kind of research, especially for me, it's very difficult not to run after interesting white hairs going down rabbit holes, basically. There's lots of just way more interesting stuff out there than I ever imagined when I started this whole work some 10 years ago or so. And there's just no end to it. There's so many leads to follow up, and they're interesting, but some of them, like this one, seem to lead to nowhere, it seems. Mind you, we never give up following these leads. And one thing we did find out, Roger pointed out that Manak was one of the first Indian women to study medicine in Edinburgh, so she did come to Edinburgh, but only in 92, probably at the earliest, so after the sister supposedly died here, after Anna supposedly died here. But we found out in the census that, and in the records of the universities, the registration records of the universities, that her younger brother, Dnyaneshwar Turkhud, studied medicine here. So that was a bit of a breakthrough for the whole research, because now we realize she did actually have an Edinburgh link, not via her academic husband, who was Irish and in Baroda anyway at the time, but she had a brother here. So why not come to see him? You know, young brother settling in Edinburgh, why not older sister? Did he come over to help him a bit, have a look out for him, especially if the younger daughter, younger sister is also coming out, check out the town, why not? And yeah, maybe she died here after all. Maybe she had some sort of unfortunate accident or something like this. So we researched further. And yes, a good colleague of Roger's, Caroline Gardner, she is a lot better at searching than we are, I have to admit. Because she's a professional genealogist, and she really dug into the records, and she did find Anna. And yeah, sadly, she did die here in Edinburgh on the 2nd of July, 1891. We've got her deaths recorded in the parish of Newington, South Edinburgh. It's her, definitely. She's married to Harriet Littledale, it says in the records. Her maiden name is given, her married name is given. We know she died at sort of just after lunch, 22:01 in the afternoon. We know her parents, all checks out, age slightly gone wrong. We know where she died, 12 Warner Park Crescent in Marchmont. And we even know what she died of, nervous exhaustion and a long septicemia of 6 days. So yeah, she really did die in Edinburgh, and we, thanks to Caroline Gardner, found that out. The informant who recorded her, had her death recorded, was D.A. Turkhud, which is her brother, and he lives in 8 Buckingham Terrace, which is just across the Dean Bridge from the new town, basically. So it's across the Water of Lees in North Edinburgh. Not a bad area. He was in a lodging house there, we found out from the census.
So, do you know, sorry to interrupt. So, do you know where her graveyard, in which graveyard her body has lied? So,
At the time, no, we looked and we couldn't find it, but we'll come to that question later. First, what we did know from this document we had here as a desk registration was the address. So we had a look at the address, 12 Wonder Park Crescent, looks like pretty much all the other houses in Marchmont. If you've been there, it's the one on the pictures, the one with the blue door. Again, Caroline had to dig into it. We found out who owned the place, but whoever owned it at the time, a grocer, he wasn't living there just when she died. We found out, luckily, 1891 was census year. We pretty much know for every house in Edinburgh in the year when Anna died in Edinburgh who lived in that house. And we found out in that house where she died, there was a family, mostly from Newcastle, who were headed by a woman, 26-year-old, reasonably young, unmarried woman who was a lodging housekeeper. So it basically was kept as a lodging house. And she had her grandmother there and a sister and a niece and so on. And interestingly, the flat was a bit bigger. It's a main door flat. It was a bit bigger at the time. There was a basement flat as well. Often main door flats are sort of basement flats for servants and so on. Because she was a lodging housekeeper, she rented it out. And there seems to be a Duncan McCall from Argyll, from near Oban, Fort William area. He was a law student. He was 25 years old. He was living there. Interestingly, no mention of Anna. So even though this is a couple of months only before she actually died in that address, she wasn't yet living there, it seems. But we guess, I mean, it's a guess like many things in this talk, is that she probably moved into the basement flat because if Duncan McCall was a law student, by July when she was there, term was probably over and he'd probably gone away. So the Mrs. Helen Cameron was probably happy to have a new lodger. So she was probably in the basement flat of 12 Wonder Park Crescent. Now, why was she there? And that was the other interesting question. Again, Caroline came up amazing, surprising trumps here because she was giving birth. She had a son in June, 26th of June. Interestingly, because 6 days later, she died of a 6-day-long septicemia. So Anna seems to have died of giving birth to Denzil, of complications there, of an injury during the birth. Yeah, 6:30 in the evening, she gave birth again, 12 Wonder Park Crescent. Again, it's the same woman, all the names stack up, stuff like this. It's even mentioned that she's the wife of Harold Littledale. And then it's very interestingly mentioned that the first informant, which is her brother, points out at the registration that Harold Littledale is not the father of that child. So she is having a child not out of wedlock because she is still in wedlock, she's still married to Harold, but Harold is not the father. And the father, we know who he is because he is given on the records, and it's a bank clerk called Henry Fane Dalrymple Sewell. Didn't know an awful lot about him. He gives a London address. It's mentioned on the record that the father is present. Now, we're not entirely sure what that means. Is he present at the paperwork stage where it's written down on the 6th of July? Or is he actually there at the birth? We don't know that. But it's interesting that he gives a London address, whereas some mother has an Edinburgh address. So, yeah, don't really know another one of these things which we don't know and probably never know. But with the address and with the name, quite an unusual name, we managed to find out a bit more. And he has got an India link. He's born in Madras, but then doesn't seem to have much to do with India. He's a bank clerk. We know he's a bank clerk in Wales, and we know 10 years later in 91, he's also registers himself as a bank clerk. So yeah, he's a bank clerk, basically. Porchester Terrace, London. Now that's an interesting address for a young bank clerk. It's quite a good address. It's north of Hyde Park. There's a famous landscape gardener living there. There's a Lord Chancellor living there. There's a field marshal living around the corner. it's not the address where you would necessarily expect a young bank clerk to live. So, and his family, he comes from a non-bank clerkish family, as to be said. He's come from quite an interesting family. His father is a colonel in the East Indian Army. 7 sons he's got, together with his wife, presumably. All of India links, Mysore, Madras, Berar, Singapore. He himself supposedly is born in Madagascar. So that's dispute about that. Army, police, civil service, trade, quite a well-connected, quite a well-off family by the looks of it. Grandfather was even more important. He ended up as commander-in-chief of the Madras Army, so basically commanded all the British troops in southern India. And there's even talk, rumor, potentially malicious, potentially not true, that he's the son of the Prince Regent of King George IV, as was to be. So, but yeah, that obviously can't be proved, and it's just a rumor which flies around on Wikipedia. So, but somebody must have made it up for some reason, some state. So it's quite a well-connected family. How she married Henry, how Anna met Henry, we don't know. No idea whatsoever. Maybe he was over in India to see his brothers and met her in India on holiday, essentially. Maybe as a bank clerk, when she was in London, she just withdrew some money and they fell in love with a bank counter. Maybe they both had interest in literature and poetry. Maybe they met at a society like that, either in India or in Britain. We do not know. It's one of the great mysteries how the two met. And yeah, I mean, obviously she was married with 3 kids. How did she get out of that marriage? Why did she get out of this marriage? Was she already out of the marriage before they met? Who knows? We will never know, very likely, unless we find a good stack of letters or diaries somewhere. I doubt whether we'll know. Yeah, even more tragically, not just the mother dies, Denzil, the son, dies as well after about 6 months. He has been brought to Broughty Ferry, basically a suburb of Dundee now, and he dies with the family of a blacksmith and his wife, Helen Piggott, and James Stephen. They've already got 6 children. Obviously, you might ask, what on earth is he suddenly doing there? We assume he went there, the mother died, he needs milk, obviously, so a wet nurse is needed. He's brought out there. Mrs. Piggott reasonably before had a baby herself, so she might have worked as a wet nurse for that time. Why not a wet nurse in Edinburgh, but one in Dundee? Again, we don't know. But we know he dies there after about 6 months. His age is given at 11 months, but really not that old. Again, there's no hiding of the fact, nobody tries to hide the fact that Henry is a father. There's no trying to hide the fact that Anna is the mother and that Anna isn't actually married to Henry. She's married to Harold back in Baroda. So yeah, there seems to be no attempt to cover up anything in the paperwork, although Henry is from a reasonably well-connected family. If it had been embarrassing in any way, maybe they could have hidden it, but they didn't. So that's interesting. We don't know who took the decision either also to bring him to Broughty Ferry. Was it the uncle, Anna's brother, or was it Henry? Who knows? All that is not known from the paper records. Yeah, the question came, the grave, where's the grave? And I looked around, like I say, I've been to a lot of, pretty much all graveyards in Edinburgh, sadly, and no, there's no grave was found. But Caroline, again, knows a few people who know a few people, and she found out that there is, in fact, an unmarked grave in Morningside Cemetery. And we found it, basically. It's right at the back in Morningside, and she's buried on the 4th of July. Little Denzil is buried on the 6th of November, and that's where they are. And here's a picture of the grave. The wall wasn't there at the time when they were buried, and neither were the houses you can see in the picture in the background. They are right at the end of the cemetery, and they've got a nice outlook towards the east, towards the rising sun. But yeah, apart from that, it looks a little bit grim around there at the moment. That's the grave where Annapurna Turkhud, Nalini, and her young son Denzil are buried. Yeah, we were asked what's the most interesting fact that has been discovered by the Edinburgh India project. And yeah, the two things which I would mention there are A, is a tragedy. How many people have come to a sticky end from Edinburgh have come to a sticky end in their involvement with India. How many lives were destroyed? I mean, we've got here Anna and Denzil, who in reverse have a tragic end in Edinburgh, but there's lots of Edinburgh people with tragic ends in India, or even come back. I mean, very recently I heard of another story of a young man who goes out Afghan War, second Afghan War in the 1870s, and gets badly injured and traumatized and gets into trouble when he's back here in Edinburgh and gets stripped of his medals and pensions and stuff like this, and ends up living in a cave and homeless in Edinburgh and Salvation Army hostel in the Cowgate. And yeah, his life is completely ruined. And there's so many cases. I mean, there are some stories of amazing success and people who became the richest man in the empire. A while ago, we looked into the life of David Yule from Morningside here, not far from the grave, actually. He grew up and he became the richest man in the empire. Yule, you probably know, if you're from Calcutta, Clive Rowe, Andrew Yule and Company. You know, he was Andrew Yule and Company. He owned the place, which owned a lot of the industry of Bengal at the time, a lot of the tea gardens, a lot of the Asansol Durgapur steel and coal and all that stuff. But yeah, his two brothers, once we looked into it, he had two brothers, and you think, well, they probably made it big out there as well. But no, one of them died of cholera quite young, and the other one seemed to have jumped overboard on a business trip to Madras. So yeah, even he, richest man in the empire, his two brothers came to sad ends in India. It seems to be quite a lottery of what you get if you go out to the colonies. That's one thing which struck me. And the other thing is the sheer volume. Going back to cemeteries, which is a bit of a hobby horse of mine. Greyfriars Cemetery. I mean, you couldn't get more oldie-worldy Edinburgh than Greyfriars Cemetery, could you, in the old town? And if you look at it, there's nothing really awfully Indian about Greyfriars Cemetery. But if you look into the records, who was buried where and what their lives were and so on, 10%, almost 10% of the people buried in Greyfriars have been to India, have India links. You know, you wouldn't think that looking at the place, because I mean, there's nothing more Scottish than Greyfriars Cemetery in Edinburgh. But yes, 10%. And the 10% we find in a lot of other things as well, lots of other institutions, 10% India links, schools, for instance. Roger and me, we've gone through school records quite a bit, Edinburgh Academy, but other schools as well, it doesn't matter which school. 19th century, between 5 and 12, 15% sometimes of the boys each school year leaving, they go out to India. I mean, means 90% don't, but you know, 10% if you think today, that's a lot of boys going out to India, be army, be it civil service, be tea, rubber planters, whatever. And that really struck me. I wouldn't have expected that, because if you look at Edinburgh, it doesn't look awfully Indian, does it? I mean, it doesn't seem to be a great impact, but there has been an impact, and I think Roger has looked into that, for instance, on the Edinburgh hospitals, for instance.
Right. So on the subject of people going to India from Edinburgh or from Britain in general, so I would like to say I was taught in school by somebody who is a descendant of one such person. So we have a community of Anglo-Indians in Calcutta, and some of my teachers were Anglo-Indians and some of my classmates as well. So it was fascinating to discover that while I was in school, and yeah, just wanted to share that. Sorry, Roger, you were saying something?
No, well, I just to absolutely support what Hauke says about how much amazing material there is. Just keep going, and we keep finding more and more and more. So when Hauke says that 10% of Greyfriars Cemetery stones have a reference to India, you think that's a lot, that's enough. And then you'd start finding people who were in India and who don't have it on the stones. So even that 10% sometimes is an underestimate. I think a couple of things that really got to me was, again, as Hauke says, you don't think of Edinburgh as a city with strong Indian links. There's, in fact, one of the most obvious things is a fake India buildings at the top of, I've forgotten the name of the street already, on George IV Bridge. There's a building which is now being...
At the end of the Victoria Street, is it?
Victoria.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So India building, there's evidence. Finally, we have somewhere that is linked to India. There's no evidence of any link to India. So if you ever want a trick question for your friends, you say, 4 things. Which one of these is not linked to India? India buildings is the one that is not linked. So more seriously, a huge amount of money came out of India through Edinburgh to Edinburgh to do things for Edinburgh, for the city, for the buildings. St. John's Church at the end of Princes Street, the people who paid for that, the largest proportion of the money that came to build that church came from India. The Union Canal, when it was brought into Edinburgh, where it is on the west side, that was funded under the control of a man called John Downey, who made his money in India. And the thing that that struck me almost more than anything else was the money that came from India to help fund the Royal Edinburgh Hospital, again in Morningside, just around the corner from the cemetery, the psychiatric hospital now. And you think that money came from people who went out to India, who made money in ways that we would now say is totally unacceptable, really, by the impact of military and other control. They were able to use their positions to make a lot of money and die very often early, as Hauke said. But if they didn't die early, they used that money in all sorts of ways. And one of them was to help fund the new town, the growth of Edinburgh in the early 19th century. People came to Edinburgh with their pensions, with their fortunes, and they paid rents, they bought property, the city's economy was supported to a greater and lesser extent over this period from about 1770 really up until certainly the end of the First World War, and to some extent during the 1920s, by these links about which we know almost nothing these days. So that's really one reason why we do this work, is to say, let's not make moral judgments and just say British Empire was a bad thing for India and a good thing for Britain. Let's say, yeah, it was in general. Let's not be either or about this, but it hasn't been a part of the stories that are told about Edinburgh. And you can't come to terms with, you can't understand, you can't begin to think about this if you don't know some of this basic information. So that's really what we're trying to do, is to get the information out there into public and talk about how these relationships built up over the course of 150 years.
Yeah, it's a bit of a sad point in the story now. Denzil is dead, Anna is definitely dead here in Edinburgh. We found the graves. So how does life go on from there? We know an obituary was published for Nalini Turkhud in a Calcutta journal at the time, Mama Bodhini. If anybody of you can find that, and presumably it'll be in Bengali, I assume, translate it for us and send it to us, that would be a great help, because, like I say, so far, most of what we know about Anna is about her father, her brother, her husband, her lover, her son. She herself is still a bit of a black hole in the middle of all of that. Rabindranath, what would also be interesting. What did he know or think, feel about Nalini's death, tragic death in Edinburgh? We know he did know that she was dead because later on he was mentioning about the beard story, that she never wanted him to grow a beard, and that he said that, well, she didn't long enough to notice that I had disobeyed her with that. So he knew that she was dead. But we don't know what else he knew about the circumstances and so on. The lives of everybody involved with her basically went on. Even her grave was reused because you saw 2 stones on her grave and you think, well, one is for Anna, one is for Denzil. Well, no, it isn't. The stones on the grave are for Rebecca Tistel or Mowat and her daughter, basically. We thought there might be some connections, but there don't seem to be any connections whatsoever. It's just 30 years after Anna's burial, just somebody else gets buried there, which is very unusual for British graves, but seems to have just happened in this case. We don't know why. It's unknown why that happened. Henry, what happens to Henry? We know he was here in Edinburgh in July to certify the death of Anna. He, very shortly after the death of Denzil, of his son Denzil, seems to emigrate. Roger found out he went to New York, February 92, saying that he was off to California, but instead he seems to have gone to Canada. In Canada, he becomes a poet. He writes a book, King Canada and Empire, Hail Canada, a collection of verses. He really gets aggressively into the being Canadian thing, if you can be aggressive about being Canadian. First World War, he writes a poem, Call to Arms, to jig up people in Canada, which was a bit reluctant to get involved in the First World War, all the way back in old Europe to join in and help the mother country. I mean, he himself, Henry, is from a very military, very empire family back in Britain, so you can understand his feelings. He is married in 94, about 3 years after Anna's death. He marries in Vancouver, where he seems to live. We don't know whether he's got children. It would be interesting, because if he had children, especially sons, they would have been just old enough to sign off for the war in Canada and go from Vancouver to Vimy Ridge, essentially. But we don't know whether they had children. It seems not. In 1944, he dies and is buried in Mountain View Cemetery. There's a picture underneath there, and they're not kidding. They really have a mountain view from that cemetery. It is Vancouver, a very beautiful place. And that's all we know about him. We've never seen a photo of him or anything like this. And yeah, we've only found, I mean, I suppose you get the book over Amazon, but Call to Arms, we've found the poem here, which is a sort of patriotic First World War poem, basically. His brother, quite interesting, civil servant in India, also born in India, in Mysore, I think. He's the one member of the family we've got a picture of. So maybe his brother looked like that, but then again, brothers don't have to look like each other. It's just the assumption. That's why I put the picture in, so you get a bit of an idea what the family looked like. He was a cricketer. He was a civil servant, but mostly he was famous for playing rugby and especially cricket. And he was in the first All India cricket side, which is quite interesting for Bengalis, not so much for Germans living in Scotland, who are not much of a cricket connection. But yes, he was playing for India, and he played with W.G. Grace once he was back in Britain and stuff like that. He wrote quite a lot of books and articles about cricket as well. Harold, the husband, mentioned in all the documents, like I say, in Edinburgh, Harold Littledale, he also remarries fairly quickly after the death of Anna. They were never divorced, as far as we can tell, so he's a widower, basically. He marries very quickly. They've got 4 more children, 2 of them in Baroda, and then in Cardiff, where he retires from India. He doesn't retire from work, because he then is a professor of literature and languages, the subject, in Cardiff, in the newly growing University of Cardiff, essentially. It was quite a bit different there. And we know he is there for about 20 years. He lives in Llandaff, which is a kind of posh cathedral suburb of Cardiff, basically, to the north of Cardiff. Very interesting, because we know from the census that 20 years before, Henry Sewell, his wife's lover, lived there as a bank clerk. Might be complete coincidence. But then again, Llandaff is not such a big place. Is there a connection there somehow? Who knows? He dies in 1930, Harold, and that's kind of the last we hear of him. Anna's brother and sister, who studied here in Edinburgh, and at least the brother who was there when all the drama happened with his sister's giving birth and his sister's death afterwards, and then the little son Denzil's death. He goes back to the family home, it seems, in Chowpatty after university days in Edinburgh, works in many charitable hospitals, clinics, and fights a lot against diseases, basically, especially malaria. He's quite famous, becomes quite famous for doing very good illustrations of looking very closely at Anopheles and so on, and of the bacteriology involved there. He's director of the Pasteur Institute. He's at the Hafkin in Bombay and so on. His sister also, like both their father, fighting against epidemics and things like that. She does her degree in Edinburgh and Glasgow and in the London Medical School for Women. She really makes sure she gets degrees. She fights against the plague epidemic in Mumbai in 96, 97, and also lives and later marries in Chowpatty, as far as we can tell. So, yeah, their families. Yeah. Oh, yeah. There was a question about what happened to the Turkhud family. Are there any descendants? We haven't looked into that in detail. Obviously, we assume that there must be quite a lot in India. Interestingly, Roger has found descendants of them in England.
Yeah, there's a David Turkhud who is an accountant in Doncaster. So I sent him a link. Maybe he's on this. He's listening to the call. I don't know, but probably one of the brother who married Ackroyd has got, I think, probably several descendants in England, and we're trying to contact them to see if they're interested. We don't know if they are or not, but we'd certainly like to find out if there is any family memory or recollections or letters.
Yeah, as to Anna's children, obviously Denzil died in Broughty Ferry in Dundee, but she had 3 children already with Harold in Baroda. One of them, interestingly, called Nalini. So Nalini, maybe there's an echo there in the middle name. It doesn't seem to be a family name in the Littledale family, so it doesn't come from her husband. It seems to be her idea. She goes off to New Jersey, New York, suburbs of New York, essentially. Another daughter goes off to Canada. Don't know what happened to her. And another son called Harold, named after the father, no doubt, goes off also to New York and New Jersey and Massachusetts and dies there in the end. So her children all seems to have gone to the States or to Canada. Again, we don't know what they knew of what happened to her mother here in Edinburgh and things like that. And again, we will never know. Quite interesting. Again, if you Google her name, the vast majority of links will direct you to Priyanka Chopra in some way. Because a while ago, and I think the project has probably died, like many film projects do in Bollywood, but there was an idea of having a sort of Bengali Marathi movie called Nalini based on her life, by Priyanka Chopra's house. I mean, she wasn't planning on playing Nalini herself or anything like this. She had other people lined up for them. Jishu Sengupta was supposed to be Tagore. She wasn't directing either. Chatterjee escaped from the Taliban, I think, who was supposed to do that. There was quite a bit of hoo-ha in the Calcutta press, especially about how steamy the relationship would be portrayed between Nalini and the young Tagore. I don't think there was that much steam in the relationship in the first place. So people in Chantiniketan and in Doroshenko were getting worried about how it was going to be portrayed and things like that. And in the end, I think the film just died. Maybe there wasn't enough of a story in it. Obviously, I doubt whether they knew what we know now about Nalini, about how she came. And obviously, that was all just based on what had been known about Nalini so far. Yes, coming to the idea of monuments, we were asked about Edinburgh links. One of the Edinburgh links about Calcutta and about India and Edinburgh is a lot of monuments. I mean, one of the things which struck me when I first came to Edinburgh is that you can never be in Edinburgh and there are always at least 3 church towers looking over your shoulders and probably 4 war memorials. And a lot of them are for colonial wars in India. And there was a question about how we deal with that and how we deal with the way those colonial wars in India are portrayed on it. Roger, maybe you wanted to say something on that matter.
I think I've already said it, really. I think that our feeling is that there's a reasonable argument that says these should be removed, either the label should be removed or the whole statue should be removed. I think we tend to the view that it's better to keep the monument, but to produce alternative labels. If you remove the statue, you remove the label, then there's no further debate. You might as well say it's all gone, it's finished, we can forget about it. And we don't think that's a good idea. We think it's better that there is a stimulus of something that you can actually begin to think about, and that the job of people like us is to provide alternative explanations or accounts or stories that say, yes, this is how it was felt at the time, but we might like to see it like this now, and think about how you might talk about those relationships. So that, like I said, that's really what I'm in it for, is yes, these are fascinating stories from the past, but we don't want to glorify the past. We want to stimulate discussion about the past in the present, because it is an important part of Edinburgh society, and we think it's an important part that is worth talking about.
Yeah, and on the subject of monuments, we've noticed, obviously mentioned it earlier, that there is nothing to Nalini, to Anna Turkhud or Denzil. The grave was reused. There's another stone there. There's another family buried there. And most graves look grim in generally. But yeah, it's not an inspiring sight with the war behind it. And some of us thought maybe there is, because she was a famous person in Bengali literature, in Marathi society as well, in the 19th century reform movement, and to some extent probably in Baroda also, whether there is scope for having some sort of way of commemorating her where we now know that she's buried. Couple of boring legal problems about this, obviously, because we don't own the grave, they don't own the grave, some other family who we don't even know whether they still survive, any of them, do own the grave, and obviously we can't just plonk a big statue on top of somebody else's grave. It's just not legally allowable, but there are ways and means around it, it seems, and if it's not too aggressive and not too permanently cemented into the ground, Edinburgh City Council might, because they have got kind of stewardship of the cemetery nowadays, might find their way to agreeing, putting up a smallish, non-fixed memorial to it. And that is something which, we'll see whether there's sufficient interest for that. But it really would be nice to have something a bit livelier, a bit more colorful around that corner where Tagore's muse from Marchmont is buried, where she came to her sad grave, and where also her son is buried. And that is something I'm kind of throwing open to the community here, and Roger as well, I'm sure, and Bashabi Fraser, who has worked a lot on Tagore, obviously, the Scottish Tagore Centre as well at Napier University with her, are probably very interested in seeing whether there's interest in that. Yeah, that's the last slide, as you can see.
Yes. That was so interesting, and I was so enjoying listening to this conversation. I forgot to look at the clock, and we have gone over our time. Apologies, but I'm sure everyone has enjoyed this a lot. So thank you so much, both of you, for being here today and for giving us this wonderful evening. We hope that we are able to have both of you with us again sometime to talk about more India-Edinburgh links and more such fascinating things that you have discovered.
Okay, great. Thank you very much for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you again.
Hope everyone has a lovely evening after this. See you again.
Yes.
Next. To your time.
Bye. Thank you so
Bye.
much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.